Hello, everyone. Good evening to those of you on the East Coast. Good afternoon to those of you on the West Coast. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ethan Marcus. I'm the managing director of the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, the national umbrella organization for the Ladino-speaking Sephardic community here in the US. And I'm really excited to have you this evening for a wonderful book talk with Jordan Stephen Scher on his new book, Dark Shadows Hover. Just a reminder, this program is through one of our Sephardic Digital Academy, an online center and database for all things Sephardic, whether it be Sephardic book talks like this, Ladino language courses, Sephardic cooking classes, Sephardic courses on history, so much more. If you're interested in learning more about the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood and other programs we offer, like the Sephardic Digital Academy, please go ahead and check out our website at sephardicbrotherhood.com. A little bit about our author tonight. Jordan Stephen Scher is an author of 4 books, 3 of which focus on Bosnia. His previous 2 books are a nonfiction and a historical fiction delving into the war in the 1990s that produced war crimes and genocide. His new book, Dark Shadows Hover, is his first for young adults that will appear to adult readers as well. Jordan is a former middle school English teacher and a social worker prior to that. He lived in Northern California with his longtime love, having met as freshmen in college. They have 2 wonderful adult children. And for more information about Jordan and his works, you can go to jordanstevenscher.com. Without further ado, I'll turn over the floor to our presenter tonight. Jordan, please unmute, and whenever you're ready, let's kavod.
Okay, and you're hearing me loud and clear?
We are.
Beautiful. Ethan, thank you so much, and thank you so much to the Sephardic Brotherhood for inviting me, and I appreciate you all attending. For me, it's this afternoon. I'm in Northern California, but wherever you are, welcome. So I'm going to divide this talk into 2 parts, and the first is sort of background, I guess, on the war, World War II in the former Yugoslavia. It's not necessary when reading my book, and I hope you all are inclined to do so, to have this background, but it does help, and certainly I've written in the book, about some of what went on during the war. So let me start by talking about. Let me move forward. Okay, hang on a sec. I could just. Oh, there we go. Okay, so 1918 to 1941. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia was sort of the name. Prior to that, it had another name, but the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, which was run as a monarchy, it still is as different republics, no longer Yugoslavia, in Southeast and Central Europe. After the war in the 90s, the former Yugoslavia broke into 6 republics. But this is where it is located, as you can see on the map. Now, I want to talk about the factions during the war in Yugoslavia, because there were several. It was a very complex and complicated war. The Germans, of course, with their goal of dominating all of Europe, probably the world, were allied in the Axis with the Italians, Hungarians, and Bulgarians, and they were fascists, of course. The Ustasha, which were a fascist militia, terrorist group, really, in Croatia. The Croatian Home Guard, which was the army for Croatia. The partisans, led by Josip Broz Tito, were communists. And the Chetniks were royalists. They were loyal to the king and the monarchy in Yugoslavia, and they were 99.9% Serb. And then the US and UK were allies, of course, and the Soviets were allies as well during the war until after the war, when the Cold War ensued. So these are areas of under fascist control. The Germans after 1942, and you could see in the map the areas in Europe that they controlled. Okay, so the Germans basically partitioned Yugoslavia, and of course they were the primary controllers, I guess, in Yugoslavia. But they took the northern, as you can see, northern and eastern Slovenia. They occupied the Serb Banat, which was in Serbia, and it was primarily made up of ethnic Germans who many did side with Germany. It established military and occupational administration in Serbia, which was based in Serbia capital of Belgrade. Okay, and then Italy, as Axis partner, annexed southern and eastern Slovenia, and they occupied the coastline along the Adriatic. The Ustaša Shah proclaimed independent state of Croatia, also known as the NDH, and they primarily controlled Croatia and much of. Now, when I say controlled, they were a puppet government of Germany, but they politically attempted to control Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And then the Germans and Italians divided Croatia in terms of administration and maintaining troop presence there. And then Hungary and Bulgaria had smaller regions. Okay, so let's dive into this. The fate of the Jews in the hands of the Germans. Well, clearly, Jews and Roma were targets, along with anyone non-Aryan, of course, and they were put in concentration camps in the NDH, which again is the independent state of Croatia, and that was beginning in the summer of 1941. Then by the end of the summer, the villages in Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, BiH is Bosnia and Herzegovina, they initiated uprisings against the invaders, the German invaders. And by the way, Germany invaded April 6, 1941. It took them 10 days to conquer Yugoslavia. So it was quite fast. But the partisans, which were communists under the leadership of Tito, and the Chetniks that were, again, solely Serb, allied briefly as the war began. And they inflicted many casualties on German military personnel. Well, of course, Hitler didn't like that, and he instituted retaliatory murders. And for every German soldier killed in these uprisings, he had his military kill 100 non-Aryans, basically. And then for every German soldier wounded, he had them kill 50 innocent people as well. So at the end of this retaliatory murders spree, 8,000 Jews were killed, 2,000 perceived communists and Serbian nationalists, as you could see, and Roma. So there were also thousands of others murdered as well. Now the Germans rounded up 7,000 Jewish women, children, and elderly, and they put them in a concentration camp called Semlin. And this was in Belgrade in Serbia. Now, hundreds died in the camp from starvation, from disease, frigid temperatures, as well as other unfortunate situations or circumstances, I suppose. And this camp was the prisoners in this camp were maintained there from the late winter through the spring of 1942. But the remainder, who did not die of other causes, were then taken out, rounded up in Belgrade, and they were placed in, hang on a sec, in a gas van. And this was actually the precursor to gas chambers. Those who were not killed, because virtually all Jews were killed in Serbia during this time. Those who not, many moved to fight with the partisans. So this is a picture of the gas van. And like I said, this is a precursor for for the gas chambers in the concentration camps. Okay. So the movement, and really this Tito, who led the partisans, this was a people's movement, and it truly was. And I'll get to that in just a bit. But essentially, they were a guerrilla fighting force, and they were fighting the Axis powers. Tito had been the head of the Communist Party, or the CPY, Communist Party of Yugoslavia, for many years prior. He was a very charismatic and really actually a brilliant tactician and leader. He ended up being the president. He was Marshal Tito from the end of the war, 1945, till 1980, when he died. But he himself had, he had this amazing, probably the most amazing resistance force in all of Europe against the Nazis. So it was clearly a people's movement, and by the end of the war, there were 800,000 partisans in the People's Liberation Army. Now, Germany launched in order to try to destroy the partisans, and it was a growing movement, of course. Germany launched 7 military offensives. Now, there were battles, many battles in between, but these offensives were primarily created to destroy the partisans. The ultimate goal of the partisans was to liberate Yugoslavia, which they eventually did. And I tell you about this too because Morris, who we're going to talk about in a few minutes, was a partisan at a very young age, and I'll get into that in a bit. Okay, so Tito, here's a picture of Tito on the left, and Mosa Pijada was a Jewish resistance leader in Tito's inner circle. And like I said, for the most part, this was a people's movement. That the fact that Pijada made it to Tito's inner circle again shows that it was a people's movement, that all people counted in this movement. As I mentioned, Tito had for many years been the head of the CPY, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. Tito was a pseudonym. Many in the Communist Party had to take on pseudonyms because when the royalist, the monarchy, the kingdom, did not appreciate having communists in their midst. So in order to try to hide their identity, for example, Tito took on the name Tito and it stuck. His real name is Josip Broz, but he took on Josip Broz, and he was known as Tito. The communists really became the only viable group left to fight the invading Nazis and their collaborators. And again, you'll see why in just a moment, but because of the type of movement it was, and it attracted so many people, and as I mentioned earlier, ultimately 800,000 partisans, it was an 800,000 partisan military. They were able to defeat the Nazis in Yugoslavia. Now, the royalists I mentioned, they were Serb dominated. The kingdom had a King Peter II, who was actually very young when he was named as king. He was in exile in London during the war. Right after the uprisings in the villages where both Chetniks, remember the Serb royalist military, really, they became military, and the partisans initiated these uprisings. The Chetniks and the partisans became enemies and fought in a civil war. So that was another element during this war in World War II in Yugoslavia. So the partisans were not only fighting the Nazis and their collaborators, but they were also fighting the Chetniks. And actually, the reason that they were fighting a civil war, eventually it was learned that the Chetniks were actually collaborating with the Nazis. Okay, so the partisans had early advantages, and there were two primary advantages. One is that there was a small cadre of Spanish Civil War veterans, and the Spanish Civil War was during the mid to late 30s, and these veterans had fought in very similar circumstances in Spain, and so they brought this knowledge and expertise, and they taught partisans how to fight in this war. And the second, as I mentioned earlier, that the partisans were not an ideology. They had communist ideology, which really includes all people. Whereas again, the Chetniks were primarily Serb. And so it was easier for the partisans to recruit people into their ranks. And I just mentioned that here. Okay. Okay. So also the partisans were expert mountain fighters, and the Balkans it's a very mountainous, it's the Balkan Mountains, it's a very mountainous region. And even though initially and for a long time, the partisans did not have the numbers that the Germans had, but because of their ability to move in the mountains, it was also a great advantage. Now, I put this here because this was a poster, propaganda, which I guess today we call social media. I won't make a political comment, but I'll say social media can be certainly part of propaganda machine. But back then, it was very important for the partisans to recruit people to their movement. And so this is it was a photograph made into this poster that was placed in different villages around Yugoslavia. And the nurse's name is Milja Marin, and she was also, as a woman, there were many women fighters in the partisans, but there were also women nurses. And this was a recruitment poster in a way. And so that was a very important element. Now, later I'll talk to you about Morris, and he was a photographer in his unit. And this is not his photo, but that was one of his roles, and it was a very important role within the movement. Okay, now this was the Nazi propaganda. They hung this nurse, Lepa Radic, who was a nurse. She was 17 years old, and this was used as an intimidation by the Nazis for anyone who was thinking about joining the partisans. This flag is NDH, the independent state of Croatia, and I just put this up here so you can see it. And then the NDH, again, the independent state of Croatia and the Ustasha. The Ustasha were a very, very, really brutal group of terrorists, and they were the puppet government of the Nazis. They established racial laws early on because they were established as after Germany won in Yugoslavia. By the end of April, the Ustasha were put into local governments and sort of the national government, I suppose, by the Nazis. And racial laws, of course, included for both for really anyone non-Aryan, but particularly Jews and Roma. The Jews had to wear yellow Jewish stars. They could not go to school, could not work, and ultimately, and certainly were harassed, and then ultimately placed in concentration camps in Croatia. And they really were vicious terrorists, and I'll go over that in just a bit. And they established concentration camps in Croatia. This was the man who started the Ustasha, and he had fled to Italy in late 1920s, 1929, and created this Ustasha terrorist group. In 1934, his group assassinated King Alexander I of Yugoslavia, and proved that they needed to be heeded, that group. So after that, Alexander's son, who was only 11, could not take charge, so a cousin did. Eventually, that King Peter II, when he was of age, as I mentioned earlier, was in exile in London. But Pavlich, as I said, was appointed by the Nazis. Again, I mentioned earlier, they controlled Croatia and most Bosnia and some of Serbia. But I want to talk about the concentration camp called Jasenovac. And Jasenovac actually had 5 other concentration camps connected to it. It was a very brutal, brutal place to be. Most of the concentration camps in Croatia did not have gas chambers. And I'll tell you how they executed their victims, really. So a total of 83,000 people were killed, though the numbers have never been really fully ascertained, killed in Jasenovac and the other concentration camps. And inside the camps and outside, there were roving militias. They killed prisoners in Jasenovac, and when they killed non-Aryans in Serb villages and in Muslim villages, they used knives, clubs, hammers, axes, and saws. That's how brutal they were. Now, the true overall numbers killed by the Ustasha is really unknown. It is said that overall, not just concentration camps, 352,000 Serbs, 26,000 Jews, and 23,000 Roma. Now, this, according to this historian, who was Serb. Okay, so Draza Mihalovic was the head of the Chetniks, and he was a Serb nationalist. And he started the guerrilla force, the Chetniks. Now, I don't know if it's an aside, but the Chetniks were also quite brutal. And the aside is that in the 1990s war, the Bosnian Muslims, who were the target of ultranationalist Serb invasion, they referred to, in the 1990s, the Bosnian Serb military as Chetniks. So they also exacted incredible atrocities on non-Serb populations, particularly against Muslims and Catholic Croats. And it is said that they murdered 68,000 people as they roved the countryside and killed villagers, burned down villages. And their goal, and it was actually this goal was initiated in 1840, but it's something that had been part of the Serb sort of desire for many, many centuries, was to create a greater Serbia. And this was also the goal in the 1990s war, this ethnically pure greater Serbia. Okay, so Greece and Yugoslavia were invaded by Germany initially. Then a resistance arises. As I mentioned earlier, the young King Peter II is in exile, and he was viewed by the UK and the US and the Allies as legitimate government. So the kingdom, the monarchy, was still viewed as a legitimate government of Yugoslavia. But again, I'd mentioned the Chetniks and the partisans were engaged in a civil war, and the Chetniks, it was learned, collaborated with Germany. And so the US and the UK switched support to Tito in 1943. Winston Churchill sent a military officer to be with Tito for several weeks. And this guy was, military officer, was quite anti-communist. But he reported back to Churchill that Tito was fighting the Nazis, and the Chetniks were actually collaborating with the Nazis. Okay, I mentioned before there were 7 German offensives. And the strategy, of course, is that each offensive was meant to disable the resistance. In the later offensives, the goal was to capture or kill Tito. And in 1943, the Allies again switched allegiance and were supporting Tito, and they actually helped him to escape. The Nazis were very close at one point in a place called Dervar, which is where a lot of my book takes place. In fact, Morris's family lived in Dervar, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But they were close to capturing Tito, and a small unit of partisans helped, well, along with the assistance of the UK, to fly Tito to an island in Italy. Okay, let's see where we're going. Okay. And then the Italians switched side in September of 1943. And there's the battle, the 4th German offensive, as you can see, the Battle of Neretva. And the reason I bring that up, it really was a turning point because, and I could talk about it later if we have some time, but Tito's brilliant plan and ploy caused the German army to go one way, and partisans were able to escape. And they also had 4,000 wounded. And Tito's reputation was he did not want to leave wounded or sick behind. And in that particular battle, he was able to virtually save 4,000 wounded, and that his reputation spread. And it was really at that point that the war turned, because many people in Yugoslavia joined the partisans. Okay. Yeah, and I said that here. Okay. So then in May 1945, May 7, Germany surrenders. They signed their declaration of surrender. And May 15th, there was still one more battle. The Ustasha escaped Sarajevo, and they staged this one final battle in Poljana. And then, of course, they lost, and that was the end of the war in Yugoslavia. Okay. So in terms of lives lost during World War II, as you can see, Yugoslavia suffered probably the greatest or worst casualties of any Allied nation. And they lost up to 350,000 men and women in uniform. And as you can see, there were 15.5 million people before the war. And it is said that 1 million civilians perished. Okay. 20,000 Soviet soldiers also laid down their lives to liberate Yugoslavia. And it's difficult. I have not been able to find numbers. I don't think there were many. Certainly there were Allied soldiers killed, but I'm not able to find the numbers. Okay, I'm going to switch gears now and talk about Morris al-Bahari. And I was introduced to Morris's story. And Morris was an adolescent who eventually joined the partisans at the age of 12. And his story is fascinating. I was introduced to the story by a friend of mine in Boston who was actually helped, a lawyer helped to prosecute war crimes at The Hague after the 1990s war. And he knew Morris, and he would go back and, he'd go to Bosnia a lot, and he met Morris. And he said, here, this guy has a fascinating story. I don't know a whole lot about it, but I've heard some things. And then my first entree, and I see Dr. Brian Kirchin is here, and I appreciate Brian being here, is a documentary, Saved by Language, where Morris is featured, and the focus is on Ladino, but Morris's experience, how Ladino did save him in the war. And I highly recommend, and I don't just say this because Brian's here, but I do recommend people watch this video. You could find it on YouTube. It's fantastic. And it was my entree into wanting to know more and to write the book. So this is a picture, and these pictures, the photos are courtesy of Dado, who his nickname is David al-Bahari Morrison, Ella's son, and he got me these photographs. As you can see, there's the siblings, Judita, who was the youngest sister, Flora was the oldest sister, Rahala, and Maric. Morris changed his name after the war, but this is 1934. Now, Morris was born in a place called Sanski Most in Yugoslavia, and he was there because his father, David, opened a store, a dry goods store. He was in business. He was in business with a brother, but that business really did not thrive. So family ended up moving to Drvar, D-R-V-A-R, also in what's called the Krajina, which is northwestern Bosnia. And David and Luna, primarily David, opened up another dry goods store in Drvar, and it was very successful. He was very well liked. By the way, in Sanski Most, there was a synagogue and a relatively large number of Jews, but in Drvar, they were the only Jewish family, but they never experienced any anti-Semitism. In fact, he was well respected. David and Luna were sought out for advice, and they were good, citizens of Drvar, residents of Drvar. Now, all three girls went to high school in a place called Banja Luka, which did have a Jewish activity center. It was a public high school, but they lived with relatives in Banja Luka. Now, the last year of Judita is the youngest, and her last year of high school, she was to be expelled because she was Jewish. This was the Ustasha were close to taking over. There was a lot of their influence. It was the Nazis had invaded, other countries in Europe. But there was a teacher there who advocated for Judita, and she was able to graduate high school. Now, David and Luna, Morris's parents, these kids' parents, sent Flora and Rahala to live with other relatives. They thought it would be safe. Judita, after graduation, came to Drvar. But the Ustasha took over after the Nazis defeated the Yugoslav army. I'm sorry, the Germans defeated the Yugoslav army. And Morris, who really had a lot of friends, he loved aviation, loved planes. He was just really a regular kid. His sisters thought he was a pest, but isn't that typical of the youngest brother, right, with three sisters? But pretty sharp kid. And one day he came home from school, and his father had to close up his shop early. The Ustasha had taken over his shop, and they were taking David's profits. And it was just, so he didn't work full days. He worked whenever, but he was home with his wife, Luna, and Morris comes home and he races past them and goes into his bedroom, and father goes in, and Morris says, or Moric at the time, I've been expelled from school, and Dad, who is Jesus Christ, and why do the kids think I killed him? And that was it for Moric going to school there. So the al-Bahari family, and by the way, there are many, many relatives in the Krajina of the al-Baharis, but the al-Bahari family, this Judita, Moric, and the parents were in July of 1941 sent to a quote collection camp. Horrible conditions. There was threats of murder and rape. Some did happen, but it was nothing like what the doesn't excuse anything, but nothing like what the concentration camp system of Jasenovac was like. But they were sent to this collection camp in July. And then in October of that year, 42, they were transported by cattle car to be transported to Jasenovac. Now they were happy about it because they didn't like this collection camp, and they thought it would be anything would be better than this. They didn't realize it was a death camp. They train, of course, there was no air. There were people dying in the car. People were leaving themselves in this carriage or the car, the train car. Finally, they had to stop in a city called Prijedor because the tracks beyond that needed repair. So some people snuck out. The Ustasha soldiers were usually drunk. People snuck out, and Morris, fortunately, one of the Ustasha was Morris's former music teacher, and the music teacher noticed was Morris, and he essentially developed a plan to help Morris escape the train. And this music teacher handed Morris off to an Italian colonel who took him back to Derdevar, where Morris changed his name to a Serbian name, he was told to, and lived with a family for 2 months. But then the Germans were coming to Derdevar. Okay, the Italians had control, but the German military was coming to Derdevar a couple of months later, and the Italian colonel told Morris he should flee. Morris lived in the mountains for several weeks before the partisans discovered him. At the age of 12, he became a partisan. He did not know where his family was. He didn't know if they were still alive. He had changed, again, he had changed his name. He hid his Jewish identity because despite the fact this was people's movement, and again, this is a 12-year-old kid, he wasn't sure about whether his comrades who might have harbored, ill will or anti-Semitism toward him. So he kept his Jewish identity secret. Morris, as I mentioned before, there's a picture of him. He was a photographer. And it was almost like a refuge for him to take these photos and then develop them. Certainly he would send them ahead to the military headquarters when he wasn't able to develop them. I've seen other interviews. He has no idea where the photos went. Eventually, many of the photos, there were no photographers' names attached to it, but they're in a museum in Belgrade. But he was also a courier or a messenger, and that was a very dangerous job. His nickname was Machi, and Machi means wildcat because he was small, he was athletic, he was very lithe, and he was able to get really in these very dangerous missions, sneak through the forests and the mountains and successfully delivered what he needed to do. Now, this is a picture of Morris to the left. You can see this is called a Topolino. It was, I think, a military vehicle of the Italians. And after the Italians switched sides, much of their equipment went to the partisans. Now, this is a video, I'm sorry, a diary page. Morris kept diary. Only 10 pages were found by Dado and Ella, Morris's widow. And Dado translated this for me, all of them. So I was able to create stories around Morris's life as a partisan because of this. Okay. This is from...
In 1944, Morris was 14 years old. He was in a field wearing his partisan uniform when he saw a Halifax plane with American and British pilots shot down.
5 men jumping with parachute and come in field where I was. And I see Americans, I go on, and when see me, they guns, who are you? And I sprechen Sie Deutsch, and everyone don't speak. Parlate italiano? No. Hablas en español, un gringo. Dice, yo hablo español. Me dice, tú say, I have kept with red star, You are partisan, not partisan, I am with partisan. Can you tell me where is Commandant partisan community. Yes, I know. I didn't speak English. I used Ladino to speak to the Hispanic pilots in their groups, David Garino. That was my only way to communicate. Ladino saved my life in war. Hablas en español, hablo porque yo soy sefardín. Lo que es esto, sefardín? No sabes nada. Lo que es esto, sefardín? Esto es una parte di hebreos dopo la Inquisición que escapada en Turquía. Ho parlato esto da mi historia. Non sabes nada. That was young people don't study about that's nothing. Por 20 kilómetros habemos una comanda partisana, e todos, that's 5 pilots, that's 5 equipage from Halifax, with me gone in Ribnik, that's very near the Cluj, and after that, with transport going to seaside in the Adriatic Sea and going to with ship in Bari.
Okay. Now, this is 1945. After the war, Morris is reunited with his parents, Luna and David. He was pilot trained. He loved to fly, or he did, was as a child would read military magazines that his father gave him, and there were planes, and he'd occasionally go to a movie theater, see newsreels of planes. So he himself was hooked. He was one of the first instructors in Bosnia, pilot instructors, and this airport is called Butmir. It became Sarajevo International Airport. Morris was actually a technical director in the construction of the Sarajevo International Airport. He was also a pilot instructor. He also helped, prior to the 1984 Winter Olympics, which were in Sarajevo, he helped to develop the airfield in preparation for the Olympics. Here he is meeting the Pope. He was very much an advocate for interreligious peace. Dado, the son, I asked him, what do you think they discussed? And he said, oh yeah, I asked my father. He said, my father said, we told jokes. So that was that, whoops. Okay, and this is Dado and Morris in 2014. And going to play you this. Actually, I'm not going to play this. Essentially, it was in memoriam, but we're running a little on time, a couple minutes. But Morris died in October of 2022 at the age of 90, almost 93. And I said he was one of the last Ladino speakers in Bosnia. So this is the book's cover. Dark shadows hover. And I loved writing the book. I really did. There's a whole process to how it all happened. But I learned a lot about the Sephardim, which I didn't know a whole lot about. I'm Ashkenazi. And honestly, sort of, Morris was, I grew up on Long Island, and I have many relatives from Eastern Europe or Ashkenazi, but Morris, he took to my heart. He reminded me so much of my relatives, honestly. Anyway, that's that, and I really appreciate your patience. And now I guess, Ethan, will turn it over to the audience for questions.
Thank you so much, Jordan, for the beautiful presentation and really informative. And again, I encourage everybody to look into purchasing the book, Dark Shadows Hover. It's available online as well for purchase. It's a wonderful book, a wonderful story. First question I have here: how does a guy from California in the Bay Area, who's Ashkenazi, who really doesn't have any kind of connection to this, how does he get into this? I mean, it's kind of extraordinary how much you really dedicated your time and your life to connecting to this narrative.
Yeah, so again, books I've written in the past were focused on Bosnia, the war in the 90s. And after those two books, though, I wondered what happened to Jews in Yugoslavia, particularly in World War II. I knew there's an organization called La Benevolencia currently in Sarajevo. It's a Jewish organization. And I had kind of heard of them. But that's it was one of those things where I said, well, the universe is going to come to me and say, what's your next book? And the universe took place first. This man, Phil Weiner, the judge in Boston, who said he knew of Morris. And then next, honestly, was the Saved by Language, which you just saw a clip. And I don't know, just a fascination. Like I said, it almost was, sounds kind of corny, spiritual, but I am in California, so we talk that way, right? The connection I felt with Morris, and then learning much more about more about the Sephardim and Morris's experiences and the partisans just kind of blew my mind. Honestly, I had been a social worker. I knew about developmental psychology and what adolescents go through. I was a middle school teacher, and I was, these are sometimes some pretty interesting kids. I can't imagine how Morris survived and did what he did, but he did. He didn't come out unscathed, and you can read in the epilogue that Dada wrote. He did not come out unscathed, but he was a pretty amazing man throughout his life.
Amazing. Just a reminder, if you have any questions for the audience, if the audience has any questions, please enter them into the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I have a question here from someone in the audience. Did the church play any significant role, positively or negatively, as it related to Jews in Bosnia and the former Yugoslavia during the war?
Very good question. I did not come across that a lot. I know that the Catholic Church, Croatian Catholic Church, during the 90s war was unfortunately very much part of that, because it was not just the Serbs, but the Croats in the 90s war. I believe, though, just have to track back, the church supported the Ustasha for the most part during the war. But it's not something I delved deeply into, so I can't answer that as I'd like.
Another question here, also a little bit of praise. I love reading the book. Can you tell us a little bit about how you decided to introduce the character Mika into the book? Was this someone mentioned in one of those pages you referenced earlier in Morris's journal, or just an invention along the way? Was it really neat to see her relationship with Morris as you portrayed it?
Right. So again, Dado, he and I had many, many Skype calls, and he didn't know a whole lot. He knew what he could do, and he did some of his own little digging, because maybe typical of many Holocaust survivors, but not all, he would ask his father about what happened to him, and his father would say, "You don't want to know." But one of the things, and there are others, that Dado said, he goes, "Yeah, I kind of recall my father telling me he had a crush on one of the older girls in his unit, partisan unit." So I took that and ran with it. Again, knowing adolescence as I did as a middle school teacher, that there's an awkwardness about relationships. And so I just ran with it. And I thought Mika was a very compelling character. And Morris clearly had a crush on her, and it comes through in the book, but he knew she was older, and he was not going to pursue any kind of romantic involvement. But it started simply with Dado saying, I believe he had a crush on somebody in his unit.
Maybe you can talk about a little bit about your previous books, and particularly your research into, the genocide and the wars of the breakup of Yugoslavia as it relates to Jews, and what you found the relationship between the Jewish community in Bosnia to the general populace during the genocide and the Civil War.
Yeah, and I will correct, it wasn't a civil war per se. It really was an invasion on the part of ultranationalist Serbs, again, with the goal of creating greater Serbia and ethnic cleansing. It became certainly a war between the Bosnian military and the Bosnian Serb military supported by Serbia. I mentioned, well, first of all, I became interested. I wrote a book. My first book was really almost out of anger, because at the time, we've certainly seen things evolve, but the Trump administration was demonizing immigrants. Still happening, of course, but I was teaching at a school with 99% were Latinx. Their parents, many of whom came from Mexico or Central America, and they were scared to death that ICE was going to be visiting their home and taking their parents away. So I wrote a book called Our Neighbors, Their Voices, and I interviewed immigrants from many different countries who live here in the States. And it included two women who were children in Bosnia during the war. And they were Bosniak, which is Bosnian Muslim. And I had not known much about the war at all. So again, did lots of research, met lots of survivors. One of my books is our witness accounts from survivors directly. During that war, there was this group called La Benevolencia, which had started actually in the 1940s, which was a Jewish community organization. And La Benevolencia was phenomenal during the 90s war in that they organized, across religious, ethnic lines, people who did not have religious beliefs. And they created an organization that provided social services, food, medical help. They even helped to get 200 and something people out of Bosnia to Israel. So La Benevolencia was very important. The Jews were not particularly targeted by the ultranationalist Serbs, but they were living under particularly in Sarajevo, they were living in the siege of under the siege of Sarajevo, which was a very dangerous place to be. By the way, after the war, and there were roughly 80,000 Jews before World War II, there were 14,000 at the end, and now I believe there's just a few thousand Jews in Bosnia. But La Benevolencia, now Morris was not a part of it, but he and his wife, Ella, were part of the Sephardic community, and they helped to keep the culture, the Ladino culture, the Sephardic culture, thriving as best they could. That was one of the things they did to volunteer during the 90s war.
Another question here from the chat. How did you decide how much, if any, Ladino to include into the book?
To include any Ladino? I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
The question was, how did you decide, or what determined how much Ladino, if any, that you included in the book?
I didn't really. In fact, my daughter speaks not Ladino, but she speaks fluent Spanish. And she said, Dad, why didn't you ask me? Because the Spanish in your book is not quite right. Because the scene where when Morris described in Saved by Language certainly is in my book, where he met US and UK so military people had parachuted down, and the only way to communicate was Ladino, because it was close to Spanish. So I didn't, especially I think the Spanish I used was not even, according to my daughter, really very well done. But Ladino was certainly a prominent part in parts of Morris's time with the partisans.
At what point from the documentation kind of history you were looking into for the book, did Morris start opening up really about his experience?
I'm sorry, so following the war, when did he open up?
Yeah, following the war, you mentioned how it was very hard for him to speak about it. At what point does he start to open up about it?
I found, so in my research, and I came across that Judita, his sister, had written a really fantastic article about her experience. I was able to use that. And certainly Saved by Language, Dado and Ella, who doesn't speak English, Dado does, I got information from them. But there were 5 videotaped interviews in Serbo-Croatian at the Shoah Foundation that were done in 1997 with Morris specifically. And I made a friend, a Bosniak friend in Utica, New York, who was very tech savvy, and he was able to transcribe those interviews into English subtitles for me. And there was one video in particular that he talked a lot, well, not a lot, but a fair amount about his partisan experience. So that's right. I also got information to create the story, which is why this is called a biographical fiction. There was nobody I was able to find who fought with Morris and the partisans. Morris didn't open up a lot. but I had to create this biography, but it is fictionalized, but using the Shoah Foundation interviews, probably, that was as open as he was, I suppose, about his experiences.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about today, what the Jewish community of Sarajevo is like in terms of what it's preserved, what it's held on in terms of that Sephardic identity.
Right. Well, today there's one synagogue in Sarajevo, and it's for all Jews, Sephardim and Ashkenazi. There is a Jewish museum. Now, the Nazis desecrated one of the original synagogues. There were 2 floors. They used the downstairs as for horse stables, so they desecrated it. Morris was involved after the war because partisan youth helped to clean up the city, and also they helped to rebuild. And Morris was part of the rebuilding of a synagogue. I'm not sure, I can't remember which one. It was one called Il Cal Grande. Maybe Brian can answer this more, I don't know. But right now there's one. I'm going to be making a presentation, I think, next Monday about Morris. Now, they don't want to hear about the war in Yugoslavia, but to folks in Sarajevo. Small Jewish community. I don't know if the name Jakob Finci, if that's a name you know of. He's very much part of it. My contact is a man named Vladimir Andriy. There is a strong Jewish community, but it's very small. I think a couple thousand folks, and they do maintain their, as best they can, the Sephardic community, and seem to be involved, not just sort of isolated or insulated, but really part of the general community in Sarajevo. Now I'm going to go visit. I want to visit. I've done so much around, my books around Bosnia. I promised myself in 2026 we're going to go to Bosnia, and I need to meet people that I know, including folks certainly in the Sephardic, well, the Jewish community.
Maybe you can talk a little bit today, more broadly, Bosnia today, 30 years post-war, post-genocide. What does it look like today?
It's not a happy place. In 1995, there was the Dayton Peace Accords initiated by Bill Clinton, and they divided the government in order to sort of appease all sides into having a tripartite, in a way, presidency with ethnic representation, Croat, Serb, and Bosniak. And one of the things they did in this Dayton agreement, yes, it stopped the war, stopped the killing. And after the genocide in Srebrenica, where over 8,000 men and boys were murdered by the ultranational, the Serbs, the world finally took notice and said, we need to stop it. So the Dayton Accords set up this government. It was very ethnically and really religiously based, because the Serbs are Orthodox Christian, Croats Catholic, and Bosniaks are Muslim. And they created an entity called Republika Srpska within the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It is primarily Serb. It is run by its own government, though it's supposed to be part of the national government. And there's a man named Milorad Dodik, who has been very involved for the last 20 years politically, and he's always rattling his saber about seceding from Bosnia. And it's really a political mess, continues to this day to be very tense. There's a brain drain. Many young people can't find work there, so they leave Bosnia. It's really kind of in a sad state, unfortunately. I mean, there are groups and organizations working to strengthen it, but I think until the Dayton Accords are done away with, and a real government that, in fact, Jacob Finci, brought to a European court a number of years ago, I'm not suing, but saying we need to have representation of not ethnic and religion, but anyone who wishes to run for office. And Jews are not allowed to run for office. Or anybody, Roma or not, anybody not Serb, Croat, or Bosniak can actually run for high office. So it's just, honestly, it's sadly kind of a political and economic mess.
guess the last question is, what's next? On this wrote this wonderful book. What's next in your repertoire for future ideas for books in the future?
I have to say, I don't know. I really don't at this point. I'm, right now doing presentations like this, and trying to promote the book. We have a new grandson in Colorado. Must see him as much as I can. So I don't really know. I haven't turned off anything yet, but I guess I'm waiting for those particles in the universe to say, okay, this is next. But at this point, I'm really focused on helping people to understand what happened in the former Yugoslavia during World War II, and using Morris's story as a way to tell it.
Well, really, thank you so much again for being here with us this evening. We really appreciate it. And for all of you who are watching, thank you for joining us. Dark Shutters Hover is available wherever books are sold. You can find it online or in your local bookstore by Jordan Stephen Scher. We appreciate it. If you've ever interested in learning more about our other programs online, please do check out our website at sephardicbrotherhood.com and all our other wonderful initiatives like our community magazine, La Gente, where we have write-ups all the time about these kinds of new books as well. Jordan, thank you so much again for being with us this evening.
Yeah, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here.
My pleasure. All the best, everybody. We say Alvermos. See you all soon.